Welcome to another episode of Code for Thought. For this episode, I had the great pleasure to talk to Greg Wilson, who, together with Brent Gorda, started a training program called the Carpentries in 1998. I met with Greg a while ago to talk to him about how it all came about and the challenges a program like the Carpentries face. Maybe you already know what the Carpentries are, but in case you don't, Carpentries are there to build essential computing and data skills. But in addition to that, they also offer training courses for teaching you how to, teach. A lot of people are going through these carpentry-style courses each year, and maybe you've taken one yourself, or perhaps even run a class. In all these years they've been running, they've established themselves as a well-recognized way to teach people essential skills in computing and data science. But, as Greg will say in the interview, the institutional backing for it is sometimes lacking, and funding can be difficult. And indeed, we've seen an example of this in recent months, early 2024 and late 23, when the Carpentries had to lay off some of their core staff, which has caused quite a stir in the community. As for Greg Wilson, Greg stepped down from the Carpentries a few years ago, but, as I'm sure you'll hear in the interview, he still feels passionately about their mission and goals. And so, without further ado, here's Greg Wilson. Thanks very much for your time today. I'm very excited to talk about software carpentries, but first I give you some time to introduce yourself.
Sure. My name is Greg Wilson. I'm a programmer and teacher based in Toronto. I co-founded Software Carpentry in 1998 with Brent Gorda. It was an on-again, off-again thing for about 12 years. And then in 2010, I left an academic position to reboot it. And over the next few years, with a lot of help from a lot of other people, grew it into a volunteer organization that teaches 2-day workshops on basic computing skills to researchers. I stepped away at the beginning of 2017. I'd burned out on too much travel. It was time for fresh ideas at the top. But the organization has continued to grow and has continued to go from strength to strength.
Indeed, and I think we need to explain what software carpentries are, because some listeners may be familiar with it, but some of them again may not be.
Sure. The Carpentries offer 2-day workshops on basic data science and programming skills, mostly to graduate level researchers who didn't get them earlier in their career. For example, you're a geologist, you're working on your PhD, there's a terabyte of data between you and your thesis, and nobody's ever shown you how to write code. You may have had a first-year programming class in Java that was aimed mostly at computer science students 5 or 6 years ago, or you may have done a bit in high school with Python, but it didn't really stick. It wasn't directly relevant to the kinds of problems that you've got. And now you're in a sink or swim situation. We're there to show people how to dog paddle. You obviously can't teach very much in those 2 days. But these kinds of workshops can get people started, point them at other resources, build their confidence a little. It seems to be working.
And how did it all start? It started quite some time ago, didn't you? Sort of in the
1998.
1990s.
Brent and I were both working in high-performance computing back then, and we realized that we were only helping a tiny, tiny fraction of scientists. For every person who's trying to figure out how to parallelize their deep learning on the cloud, there's 100 other people who are struggling to get desktop quality software working to do a bit of basic data analysis. And nobody was helping them because it was too mundane and pedestrian. I learned later that this is sometimes called the public health problem. You can go and get £1 million grants for telerobotic brain surgery, which will only help a handful of people in the world, but is really good for the minister to stand in front of on opening day. It's much harder to get money to do much needed repairs on water and sewage systems, even though that will save many more lives, because it's boring, because it's so everyday. And yet that's where most of the benefit is going to come. So computer science departments aren't interested in teaching the Unix shell to students in biology, because why would they? It's not computer science, and I accept that. But biology departments don't teach it because they don't think it's biology. And so basic skills like that, like breaking your code up into functions, like using version control, how do you test a piece of software, or at least validate that it's doing the right thing? All of this seems to fall between two stools. And that's where the Carpentries come in. And I have to say that it's been enormously gratifying to see the Carpentries grow and spread into dozens of countries. The organization has now taught workshops on every continent, including Antarctica, which is,
Antarctica as well.
there was a workshop in Antarctica several
Oh,
years ago.
okay.
We haven't taught a workshop on the International Space Station, but I'm sure somebody is trying to find a way to do that. But it hasn't yet had any noticeable impact on undergraduate curriculum guidelines or content. And that, for me, was always the big prize. There's a world of difference between feeding the hungry and ending hunger. What you
Yes.
always want to shoot for is some sort of institutional change so that these sorts of remedial workshops are no longer necessary. There was a time when people in the life sciences weren't taught statistics. But in the post-war years, statistics became a normal and then a required part of the undergraduate curriculum in anything to do with life sciences. You can't get a biology degree at any reputable university anywhere in the world today without going through at least one statistics course of some sort. We haven't seen the same sort of sea change when it comes to basic computing skills. Often they're just something you're supposed to pick up along the way as you're doing something like that statistics course.
Do you think it's the perception of the universities? Because you mentioned it's a pedestrian task or considered to be a pedestrian task, and therefore maybe the word carpentries, that they think it's a computer science. But hey, I'm a biologist. Why should I worry about computer programming language?
Brent and I chose the name software carpentry to make it clear that we weren't teaching software engineering. We're not teaching you how to build a dam. We're teaching you how to hang some drywall or make a door that doesn't squeak. But I think there are two forces at work here. One of them is, if you are senior tenured faculty, you got there without anybody teaching you these skills, so you believe that others can get there without being taught as well. So there's survivor bias. Absolutely. But years ago, when I was arguing that there ought to be at least one computing course, one serious programming course in undergraduate chemistry programs, a professor of chemistry finally lost her temper and snapped at me quite reasonably because I was being a jerk and said, okay, what do we cut? Do we cut organic chemistry or thermodynamics? Right? The curriculum is full.
Yeah.
If we're going to add something, we have to identify something to take away. And the curriculum is already full to bursting and still not getting students to the point where they can understand leading edge research in any domain. And we all accept that. So I don't think it's willful ignorance. And I don't think it's skepticism. I think everybody understands the value of computing.
Yeah.
It's just, where is the time? Where is the money? Where are the rooms? Where is the time to train the people who are going to teach this stuff? What do you drop? Do they do less lab work in order to do more computing? I think most faculty in engineering, for example, would say that right now students aren't getting enough hands-on time compared to a generation ago. They've already made cuts there. Should they cut that further and have people who are even more divorced from the core of their subject matter? Should we push it down into the high schools? I'd be a big fan of that. I mean, computing is the only thing I can think of where you start from zero at the university level. We assume you've done some math before you hit university. The calculus course doesn't start with basic arithmetic. But if we're going to push computing down into the high schools, what do we cut there?
I had a discussion about a similar subject, about exactly the same thing with someone else recently. And he argued, well, if we do it in undergraduate level, then they may not touch programming for quite some time until they get to the point where they do the thesis, at which point they do need a course like that. But even if we offered them a course, say, at the beginning of the studies, they do it, they get the degree, they do this thing, and then they forget it until the moment they actually need it.
I think you would find a lot of people who believe that is true of statistics.
Yes,
But
that's true.
But we still teach the statistics early on, and we give students a full semester, sometimes two, depending on the school and the nature of the degree. And we expect them to be able to call on it when they need it. And again, one can envision a stable state in which we expect students in their third year or their fourth year of a biology degree to remember enough statistics to write up the labs that they're doing, do a t-test on whatever lab they did on a Thursday afternoon. It would be reasonable if we had computing in the curriculum to say you're supposed to hand in an R Markdown notebook or a Jupyter notebook, which is the result of the lab analysis. That's a stable state. The problem is how we get from here to there.
I think the magic formula obviously hasn't been found, because what you're saying or implying is that the state that you found yourself in 1998 seems to be fairly similar to the state we're currently in 2023.
I wish that I had done a much more rigorous job all through the last 25 years of assessment. I don't have data to say, here's the level of computing skill in the undergraduate physics population or chemistry population in 1998, 2008, 2018, and so forth. And neither does any government agency I've ever talked to. When I was a professor in computer science at the University of Toronto, I applied several times to NSERC, which is our equivalent of the NSF, for funding to go and do things like the Carpentries. And assessment was going to be part of that. And I actually got turned down 3 times in 3 years because it wasn't regarded as computer science research, because it's looking at the impact on people of training as opposed to developing new algorithms. And I guess I understand that intellectually, but I still think it's very wrong-headed. And I think that if we had started collecting data then, we'd be in a much stronger position now to know what's working and what isn't and what impact it's actually having. There's an old joke from the 1960s, somebody saying that half the money he spends on advertising is wasted. He just doesn't know which half. Right?
Yeah, indeed.
I think the same is probably true of things like the Carpentries and of a lot of work in open science and open access publishing. There's no way that everything we're doing is actually having an impact long term, but we aren't collecting enough data or doing enough studies to know which parts are working and should be emphasized and which parts aren't, in part because who's going to fund it? I mean, you know about the research software engineering community in the UK and how it's had to bootstrap itself. There wasn't antagonism or animosity, there was indifference. And we see the same. Canada still doesn't have a research software engineering association. And everybody wants the computing power. Nobody wants to pay for the training that's necessary to get us there.
It's true. And I think part of that is because, I know it's a very popular term, the silo thinking. But when you take, for instance, data science or machine learning and artificial intelligence, people think about it and think algorithms and architecture, but they don't think about, say, the cleaning of the data and the data processing of the data pipeline, which actually is 80% of the work, which requires standard software engineering techniques.
I'm going to push back on that.
Okay.
I think many parts of that work are a good fit for fairly traditional mainstream software engineering techniques, but not all of them. And again, it comes back to a conversation I had many years ago with a scientist. I was teaching a class how to write unit tests using a unit testing framework. And I'm now developing software for a company. We have almost 100% test coverage. There's no way I'll accept a change to the software that doesn't include a few tests to show that the change is actually working. So I've shown them how to write the framework. And this guy says, okay, so what tests should I write? And I said, I don't know. I don't study rapidly rotating, highly magnetized black holes. And he said, but I don't know what test to write, because if I knew what the right answer was, I would already have published and moved on. In many parts of machine learning and any kind of leading edge research, you have the problem of testing software where you don't actually know what the right answer is in any of the hard cases. Yes, you can do analytic solutions in simple cases and make sure your software is close enough. But A, if the problem is simple enough, you can do an analytic solution. Why are you writing code? And B, how close is close enough?
But my main point was really, there is this part of machine learning and artificial intelligence, and then there is the other part which doesn't involve the algorithms, but the really nuts and bolts without which artificial intelligence, machine learning would not be able to perform and happen.
I agree. I don't know right now what to think about large language models like ChatGPT. On the one hand, I'm deeply skeptical because the people I see hyping them are people who have a long track record of pumping things up, taking the investors' money, and then moving on before things collapse.
Yes.
It feels like Bitcoin all over again. On the other hand, when people like John Udell and Simon Willison and Ian Bicking are very enthusiastic about the possibilities of this, they are smarter and much more knowledgeable than I am. They are all better thinkers than I am, and they are genuinely excited about the prospect that these tools could further democratize programming, like make more of the power accessible to more people. I'm afraid that a lot of the good is going to be buried under a combination of hype and hastily written legislation. But I'm also concerned that there are essentially no quality controls in this field.
And the lack of people learning it or
And
teaching it.
there are a lot of people who could, but I think the audience isn't receptive, partly because there's so much money to be made right now that they don't want to slow down and do it right or do it safe. But also, I think it's a case of the blind leading the blind. I think that rigorous testing of scientific software has been so rare for so long that it's not expected in the field. It's people are looking around and what they're doing is as good as what they had to do to get their doctorate and get a best paper prize at some major conference. And we are struggling as a field to figure out how to give people credit for their software. We have no idea how to review that software when it's used for publications. I know how to do a code review, but again, it comes back to a question of resources. Every journal is struggling right now to find reviewers. If you then say to them, and now you have to go through the code and do a few independent tests on that, so the time to review will triple or quintuple, the answer is no. And that's a reasonable answer. And we just don't know what to do about that.
I would like to go back to something that you mentioned earlier, democratization. And I think Carpentries to some extent are democratizing coding, aren't they?
Yes.
And I think they're built around this concept, or did I get that wrong?
Yes. My successor as director of software carpentry, Jonah Duckles, and then Tracy Teal, who was the first director of the Unified Carpentries, and now Kerry Jordan, who is leading the effort, all care passionately about putting this power in more people's hands. And the Carpentries' emphasis on getting out of Western Europe and North America, for example, is humbling, is inspiring. There's tremendous work being done by the Carpentries in Africa and Latin America, Southeast Asia, and all of this has produced a virtuous feedback loop. One of my friends and colleagues is based in rural Argentina and has more than once come back and said, what you're teaching and the way you teach it doesn't work here because of all of these assumptions you've made, because I'm living in downtown Toronto with reliable high-speed internet and a whole host of other things. So democratizing for the Carpentries hasn't just meant make it accessible to more grad students in Belgium, and it's make it more accessible to everyone where they are and bring more people from more diverse backgrounds into positions of power so that they can make sure the organization continues to progress. That for me might be the biggest long-term impact of the Carpentries. It's not the computing skills, but making people more aware of what life looks like for their colleagues in other places and in other circumstances.
Yeah, it's quite astounding evolution, if I may say so. I mean, you started this with a colleague of yours. I mean, how were the first few years then? Because it's quite different to what it is now because there are so many people involved. But how were the first few years?
Well, the first few workshops were taught at the U.S. National Labs on contract and almost on a dare. I had been grumbling about the fact that most scientists didn't know how to program. And John Reinders, who was the head of the Advanced Computing Lab at Los Alamos, finally said, put up or shut up. Come down here for a week, teach, show us that it'll make a difference. And so Brent and I scrambled to put some curriculum together and went down to New Mexico half a dozen or 7 or 8 times over the next few years. And it seemed to help. When we rebooted in 2010, it was mostly with sponsorship from like-minded people in academia. People had a bit of leftover money in a grant or had something in the training budget that they needed to spend. So we cobbled that together to get us going through our first year, revised the curriculum, made a lot of mistakes. I taught a lot of things that were irrelevant or unnecessary, but re-geared. The biggest change, I think, came in about 2012 or 2013. We were very frustrated we were very frustrated with a bunch of things. But one of them was with the effectiveness of the teaching. And so went off and actually did a dive into the research literature on teaching and learning. And it turns out that we know as much about teaching and learning as we know about public health. But the average university professor has not been exposed to any of it and teaches the way that they were taught, and bad practices then continue. So the Carpentries began running training workshops to teach people how to teach. And again, long term, that might be a bigger impact than teaching computing skills, because several thousand people have now gone through that 2-day instructor training program. And they've been exposed to the fact that brains learn in particular ways, that there is a methodology to designing an effective lesson and telling whether or not it's effective, that all of these things can be done as reproducibly and as reliably as software development or as a lab experiment, which is to say every single time is going to be different, but there are patterns and you can learn those patterns and they will make you more effective. So teaching a few thousand people how to teach better may have, in the long run, more impact on academia than teaching the programming skills. Because, of course, once you know how to teach better, you can turn around and apply it to your economics course, your psychology course, your
not just
whatever else that you're doing. But that is something that will take years at least to show
generations. So what happened in
generations? like decades. I'm willing to go for a decade or two, but generations. I got to cling to what hope I have, man.
I know. I just see the Darth Vader mask behind you, and but it's a pink one. So
yes, my daughter made that for Halloween many years ago.
Okay.
Princess Darth.
So what happened in 2010 that necessitated a reboot? You mentioned 2010 there was a reboot.
Yeah, I needed a job. I had been a professor for 3.5 years. I had an 0 for 5 record on getting grant funding. I'd come in from industry and wanted to do things that didn't fit neatly into funders' models of what tier 1 research at a computer science department looks like. I was interested in educational aspects. I was interested in practical assessment of programming systems. And there is now a very large, very well-organized community of people who do empirical studies of programmers, but it wasn't nearly as large back then. And quite honestly, as somebody who was in a non-tenure stream position, I was always going to be back of the queue for funding compared to people who either had tenure or were tenure track. And somebody eventually took me aside and explained it to me that as somebody who was not on the tenure stream, I would always be the last one to get funding. And at that point, no funding means I can't do the research I'd gone there to do. I could have switched over to teaching stream, but I decided that I didn't particularly like working in large, slow-moving bureaucratic organizations anyway, and thought very seriously about going back to being what is now called a research software engineer, although the term hadn't been coined then, but decided to give the Carpentries a try, because I've always enjoyed the teaching and it seemed to be where I could have the most impact.
I think the teaching aspect is what I want to talk about next, because I think that puzzled me also a long time to see how effective teaching can be, because often we stumble into these positions where we have to, well, can you jump in and give a course for that? You know, I'm off next week, I'm going to a conference. Yeah, okay, I do that. And I did that in the past and I feel terrible afterwards. And I thought, well, what, if anything, did the students actually take home from that one?
So there's a couple of thoughts here. One of them is that in Silicon Valley, you'll often hear people talk about 10x engineers, programmers who are 10 times more productive than their peers. As far as I can tell, the only reliable way to be 10 times more productive is to make 10 other people twice as productive. The idea that one person can produce 10 times as much code or code that's 10 times the quality. Yeah, there are a few geniuses, but there are very, very few.
Yeah.
And genius doesn't tend to matter a lot when you're tackling very large projects. Whereas if you can take 10 people and double their productivity, you have raised the overall productivity of the organization and you've helped 10 other people. And you can scale that. You can make 100 people twice as productive as they were by teaching them a few things. And there's no way that you as an individual could, on your own, produce all of the extra things that they are now able to produce. Unfortunately, teaching and training in industry almost always takes a back seat to everything else. Learning is something you're expected to do somehow on your own time, or maybe soak up a few technical skills by osmosis. And this feels foolish to me. That's part of what attracted me to it, was I'm a terrible researcher. Quite honestly,
You
quite
really?
honestly,
Uh,
I have worked with people who are really good researchers, and they are all more meticulous than I am. They're careful
mm.
in a way that I'm not. My partner is a very good cook and follows recipes. I've only once in my entire life actually tried to follow a recipe,
And
right? Which means that I can throw meals together, but only simple meals,
yeah.
right? So that isn't the kind of outlook that you want in somebody who's supposed to get a right answer you can rely on, right?
Or a good meal.
Or I'd like to think my chili is pretty good, but it's never the same twice, right? So those kinds of skills, the place I can help most is to help people like that be more productive. I'm no longer part of the Carpentries leadership. I teach for them occasionally, but they've created an organization that every single year helps literally thousands of people be
Mm.
more productive for the rest of their life.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing, isn't it?
And they do it on a shoestring.
Yeah, I was wondering about how sustainable that is because it's a voluntary organization that you mentioned. It obviously has, I say obviously, I hope it has some paid position where people actually
There
can.
are, I believe, 11 full-time positions right
Mhm.
now, funded through a variety of means. And you'd have to talk to the current executive about the funding model and where it comes from. But a colleague once told me that Google Doodles, when they customize the search bar, you go to the google.com homepage and they'll have something for Halloween. Okay, those cost about $1.5 million each.
Right.
By the time you factor in all of the people who are involved in building it, in testing it, marketing has to be involved, legal has to be involved.
Mm.
Somebody estimated that cost about $1.5 million for each of those Google Doodles. So the Carpentries' entire budget in the last year that I was running it, which was 2015, was
Mm.
1/3 of a Google Doodle. Okay. Of the two, I think I know which is having more impact on the well-being of our species. Like, not trying to toot our own horn here, but
Yeah.
the sums involved are so small compared to the benefits that it drives me nuts that there isn't more funding for this, because it will have a more dramatic effect on research than
Yeah.
almost anything else that you could spend a few $1 million on.
I mean, that's the amazing thing because I think when you talk to researchers and equally when you talk to funders, I think we all recognize that with our software nowadays, you have basically no research, at least for a large part of it. But yet, when it comes to funding positions in software engineering or in teaching, you don't get that.
It's again, coming back to public health, which is something I've been looking at for analogies. There was an instance here in Toronto where one of the hospitals turned down an offer of, I'm told, over $200 million to put
Hmm.
an extension on a hospital because nobody would give them money for the staff that they would need. What's the
Yeah.
point of adding a new wing to the hospital if you don't have nurses, if you don't have janitors, if you don't have doctors, if you don't have admin staff? Everybody wants their name on the building. And will the American healthcare system get to the point where you see nurses in the sort of uniforms that you see football players and Formula One drivers wear, where they've got 5 different sponsors' logos on them? If that's what it takes, that would be really sad. But nothing else is working. And this brings us to one of the biggest regrets I have about leaving the Carpentries when I did. This wasn't clear in my mind. It was there, but it was vague. But it goes something like this. Step 1, teach people some programming skills so they can do more science. Step 2, how about we teach you how to teach these workshops so that we can scale up? And that's where the Carpentries are now. Step 3, you're probably tired of scrambling around looking for spare change in the back of the couch in order to fund these workshops. Let's teach you how to organize. Let's
Mhm.
teach you what is also a very well-studied, well-understood set of skills, which is organizational change. There isn't a business school in the world that doesn't offer courses now on organizational change. So let's teach that to the researchers so that they can go and get the changes to curriculum, the changes to funding model. How do you make your case to the dean or the provost that there ought to be 50,000 euros set aside every year from the university budget to fund this kind of training? I think that a logical next step for the Carpentries would have been to take people who've learned to program and then need to learn how to teach, Now take the people who've learned to teach and say, here's how to get the institutional change you need so that you can focus on the teaching rather than running around with your hat out hoping for pennies. And my hope would be that once people know how to do that to get support for this kind of training, they could then use those skills for other things that I regard as more important, like fair pay for graduate students or adjuncts, like more inclusive hiring practices, like insisting that every conference have a fully remote option, because even as COVID subsides, there are health risks and carbon load for people flying around. And most of my colleagues from Africa and Latin America
can't afford it.
Can't afford it or can't get visas. I am furious that so many conferences that went virtual during COVID, and by doing so, were finally opening their doors to people like my colleague in rural Argentina, have decided to slam that door shut in their face now that the risk of COVID is subsiding. Let's go back to telling the majority of the people on this planet that they're not welcome. It disgusts me. And everybody knows that we're doing it, and everybody mumbles and looks away and feels a little bit guilty and then goes back to saying, but we're only going to do in person and you have to fly to Rome for this conference or Pittsburgh or something like that. No, we should be better than that. And I want to teach people, or I'd like an organization like the Carpentries to teach people how to organize to get that changed.
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely necessary, because I absolutely agree with you on this one. And that touches on things like open science, for instance. I mean, we've been preaching that until the cows come home, and the cows have come home, and it's still not changed, because ultimately you need to make a change in the institutions that back this up. And so far that hasn't happened.
We don't need yet another position paper on the benefits of open access publication. We don't need yet another call to arms. What we need is people who will go and get themselves on the right committee so that on the right day they can cast their vote, and we'll have N+1 votes, and we can get section 15 subsection C paragraph 3 changed. And one of the models here is the way that people like Neil Chu-Hong, Simon Hetrick, James Hetherington in the UK were able to do the institutional work to get research software engineer recognized as a job description. It sounds like bureaucratic pettifogging, and yet it changed everything. Once there was a page saying, here's a job, here's a career path, here's a box you can tick when you are applying for funding to say, I need 1.5 RSEs for 3 years, rather than having to try to explain that you're hiring a programmer, but they're not doing IT. Everything got in easier, and now there's a career there that people can pursue. And hell yes, that is changing things. But it didn't happen because we wrote better software. It happened because somebody sat through a whole bunch of really boring committee meetings and filled in a whole bunch of paperwork and very patiently did the work to get the institutional change. Daniel Katz in the US has been doing a lot of this same kind of work, very slowly, very patiently, getting himself into the right room, in the right committee, getting listened to at the right time. Andy Stefik, who's a professor at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, is the reason why high school computer science courses in 2 states in the United States now have to be accessible to blind students. He did the work of testifying in front of committees, writing position papers, helping legislators understand the problem, to the point that when there was a piece of legislation, they said, okay, Andy, what have we missed? And he said, well, why don't we add a few paragraphs here? And they listened to him. And it took several years to get there, but it worked.
But I think it shouldn't be left to chance, or it shouldn't be left to, we wait for the right personality to arrive.
Absolutely.
So when are the organizational change carpentries coming then?
I no longer run the Carpentries. I would be happy to organize that. I don't know that I'm the right person to teach that, because I don't think I've had enough and diverse enough experience of pushing through those kinds of changes. I think there are a lot of people who've been doing very patient work around diversity and inclusivity in hiring practices in universities who've had a lot more experience with this. I think there are people who've been pushing around, for example, requiring pre-registration of experiments. Okay, so there is a regulatory change that has a dramatic impact on the science that is slowly gathering momentum. I'd like to hear from people like that about what has worked and what hasn't. The Carpentries didn't invent any of the theory of pedagogy. They went and
Yeah.
looked and said, there are people who've spent their entire lives studying this. Let's pick it up, take the parts that we think are relevant and apply those. Similarly, I've got half a shelf full of books here on organizational change and techniques for it. Some of it written by social activists, some of it written by people in button-down collars with MBAs talking about corporate change. But there's a rich literature out there. We as researchers who want to be able to do better research should be humble enough to go and use somebody else's life work rather than insisting on starting from scratch.
Humility is what we need.
And I have to say, on a personal note, I suppose they've all been personal notes so far, but I was breathtakingly arrogant for most of the early years of the Carpentries, and I deeply regret it because I thought information only needed to flow one way. I will talk about programming and everyone else in the room will soak it up. The thought that maybe the other people in the room had something to tell me that I ought to learn about how to organize a volunteer organization, how to be more inclusive of people with different backgrounds, how to a whole bunch of things. Sometimes called physics syndrome, right? I'm a physicist, therefore your problem is trivial.
Yes.
Right? But I was certainly subject to that and probably still am. I'd like to think I've learned from that mistake that I cannot ask people to respect what the research tells us about climate change or vaccination or anything else if I'm not also willing to respect their hard work. We have a lot of colleagues in academia who have spent their entire lives studying social organizations and how they change. So turnabout is fair play.
I think that's quite a positive note. A, there are enough experts in the fields that can teach us something. And secondly, I think there is also a momentum. And I would like to end on a positive note. There is momentum for change. We have the Carpentries. The Carpentries evolved. They will evolve in future. And maybe we get to the point where we can also organize organizational change.
I hope so. I agree there is momentum. Unfortunately, over the last few years, a lot of that momentum to me seems to be in the wrong direction. Public education is under constant attack from people on the right who don't like the message and are therefore trying to smother the messenger. Take a look at any number of events in the United States with academic independence being undermined. Take a look at the state of funding in the UK. Take a look at the politics of several European countries, which have taken a sharp turn to the right. As I said at CarpentryCon in Dublin in 2018, there's no point in open access if there are things you are not allowed to say. There's no point in open science if there's questions you're no longer allowed to ask. And I feel that we've been losing ground steadily since about 2016. And I think that we have to take positive action to defend free inquiry. And even now, unfortunately, to defend the notion of an objective scientific truth. You have seen, we've all seen the disinformation around COVID and vaccination. I would not have believed that so many people, particularly so many people who in power, who are apparently well educated, would simply disregard evidence at the costs of millions and millions of lives. And I think that it is grandiose to say it, but maybe if we can teach people how to organize and get institutional change to fund a programming workshop, maybe they will then use those skills to get better working conditions for junior academics. And then maybe they will have developed the muscle and the experience to tackle the things that are really important because they're all coming due at the same time. I think we all know that the next 10 years are going to be dark and difficult. We need more science and more courage.
Indeed, exactly. And I think we also need more people like yourself and the many, many volunteers of the Software Carpentries and in other organizations.
As I said earlier, I stepped away in 2017. The Carpentries is now being run by people who work as hard as anybody I've ever known and are making a huge difference in the lives of thousands of people every year. And I can no longer speak for the organization. It is theirs now. And the fact that it has gone through several changes of leadership and still continues to grow gives me hope that there is something there that might last because it's valuable and because people are so committed to it. So yeah, if any of your listeners want to volunteer, carpentries.org is easy to find, and they would be very grateful for your support.
Thank you very much, Greg.
Thank you for your time.
keeping the lights on for organizations like the Carpentries is surely difficult. And I must say, I do like Greg's ideas of teaching people how to bring about organizational change in local universities and research centers, but maybe also elsewhere, and how to influence policy and decision makers in an effective way. And perhaps in future, we will see a Carpentry-style course on change and change management, who knows. In the meantime, the business of the Carpentries, of course, continues, and if you are interested in a training course or you would like to become a trainer yourself, go to the website to find out more. Oh, time's up. See you next time. But before I forget, this podcast is covered by the Creative Commons license. See ya.